this event officially launches Diplo's pilot course on data governance in the digital economy. So with these words, I would like to warmly welcome again our course alumni, as well as the other attendees as well, and the distinguished speakers that we have with us today. So let me just start by walking you through the agenda and the plan for this session. We will begin with some welcoming words by Diplo's director and the head of the Geneva Internet Platform, the GIP, Jovan Kurbalia. After that, we will hear from the three speakers that we have here today with us, who are not only extremely knowledgeable and experienced in their own areas, but they also have a particularly privileged vantage point, I would say, looking at developments at the digital area, and particularly developments related to data governance, not only because they are in three different continents, but also because they are at the forefront of international organizations and large think tanks in Geneva, Switzerland, Brazil, and China. I will not try to summarize their impressive bios here. It would take too long. So I invite you to take a look at the website of the event and read through and see their work and publications and accomplishments. I will just briefly mention their names and current occupations. So we have with us today Pilar Farjanes Garcés. She's chief of the digital economy policy research section at the e-commerce and digital economy branch of the division on technology and logistics at UNCTAD. And she's also the lead author of the UNCTAD Digital Economy Report. I am sure we will be hearing more about this report today. We also have with us Luca Belli. Luca is a professor at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, FGV, a law school. He's the head of the Center for Technology and Society at FGV. He's the director of CyberBRICS, and he is also an associated researcher at Paris II University. And we have a Professor Liu. I don't know if he's already with us or not. He's connecting with us from Beijing, so I guess it's a not very convenient time for him. But Professor Liu is an expert in air and space law, global governance, and digital economy. He has an extensive professional experience in emerging technologies, and he's also heavily engaged in the work of several international organizations. So we will hear from these experts in a minute, but first, let me just tell you that we would like to have a very interactive event. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat. First of all, I will keep an eye in the chat throughout the meeting. Don't wait for the Q&A part at the end of the meeting. Just post your questions as they come to you, and I will try to slide them into the conversation so the speakers can tackle them right away, and to the extent possible, I will do that. And if you want to voice a question at the end and you want to do that using the microphone, just raise your hand and our team will unmute you. For the moment, you are muted. With that, I would like to start this conversation by passing the microphone to Diplo's director, Jovan Kurbalia. So Jovan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marilia, and a big hello from Geneva. This course is particularly interesting and unique for us because it shows Diplo's style of responding to the needs. A few months ago, when Marilia was running the course on digital economy, she came with the notion that many discussions on digital economy during that course ended to the question of data. Therefore, we developed the course with Marilia and a group of experts on data, focusing on this specific issue as an example of just-in-time agile approach to the learning. This is the wider context why I'm particularly pleased and happy to address you today and to welcome what I just heard from our colleagues, Andre and Dragana from our course team, who together with Marilia put a lot of efforts, that we have 32 participants from 24 countries coming from Africa, Latin America, Europe, Asia, in particular Pacific Island states. Those of you who know Diplo know that we put a lot of efforts on inclusion of small island states. And we are genuinely looking for the next 2 weeks of intensive discussion of this important issue. Today, and particularly honored to welcome our speakers, Pilar Garcés, Luca Belli, and Leo Hao. And thank you for joining us in this kickoff discussion of our course. Now, let me just reflect a few points or make a few points on data. Data has become a buzzword. Data is oil of new economy, and you know all of these points mentioned in various debates. And as data discussion is becoming hype and it is becoming more present in public discourse, there is a need also to put it in the right context and to some extent to demystify concept of data. And this will be one of the main angles of our course, to see what really means the data in the context of digital economy. But also, what does it mean practically? And here you will be getting insights from our data and AI team, showing, practically speaking, what does it mean to use data, how to contextualize data, what is the reality when it comes to the quality of data, especially in the link to the artificial intelligence. Therefore, that's the first point, demystifying the buzzwords and putting it in realistic technical context, but also what is very important in the context of human development. Data should be, as much as it is possible, public good, and it should benefit the whole of humanity. This means practically of putting individuals, communities, and their rights and developments in the center of concern, as it was, as you will be hearing, of the question of data governance. Therefore, from technology to the human-centered approach, and then to the practical issues of data governance. As you will see during the course, it's not that easy to find a single definition of data governance. There are many, but I would invite you to be skeptical and critical on single definition, except if they are just really general ones. What is the reason for this difficulty? One of the reasons is that data is the same concept issue with different perspectives. You have the same data, zeros and ones, seen from commercial perspective, which will be the main economic perspective of our course. But you have also human rights community seeing it as a privacy challenge, or security community trying to protect it, or standardization community. And then when it is seen from all of these angles, data gets different perspective and ultimately different definitions of data governance. In addition, data is very, very movable. It moves across jurisdiction, and it's difficult, not impossible, to pinpoint data to specific context. Therefore, this is a journey, demystifying, providing you with technical insights as well, then moving to the human-centered approach and landing to the governance issue. Different perspectives, but with the main focus on economic governance. Now, let me just briefly reflect in what context, in, let's say, what house, your virtual house you're entering by joining this course. You're entering Diplo, which has three main pillars when it comes to the data governance. First is research. We do research on big data, diplomacy, AI, and different issues. Then we provide courses, this course, but also many other courses with data components. And then we have data, AI and data lab, which is helping us to walk the talk. You can speak about governance issues, but it is important also to create applications, to develop tools. By developing tools, by touching technology, you can also get the new insights. Therefore, this is Diplo's approach from three angles: research, courses, and practical data lab. I would like to invite you also to explore that interplay, that interesting nexus during the course. This is a journey. This is a journey of discovery. The course itself is a learning journey. We can provide a lot on this journey from different perspectives as I listed them. But the key for the journey is that we walk together. You're coming, you're professionals, you're coming with definitely unique and interesting perspectives. And that this journey could be enriched through your critical points, reflections, bringing example from your practice, from your daily work. And good or bad news is that data affects us from our private life to our professional life. Therefore, I would like to invite you to join this journey with full steam, with full creativity. You have an excellent guide. You won't be lost. Marilia, as you know, is a great expert in this field, and Marilia will be navigating even sometimes complex and contradictory issues. But what is important, the end point of our journey over 2 weeks is to have better informed officials, to have also some sort of toolkit to navigate this field, understanding of the language, understanding of technology. I will be trying to join you as much as I can, because this is the most exciting part of my work, to engage in the learning process and learning journeys. Unfortunately, very often, like today in 20 minutes, I have to go to the other meeting, which is request of my position as leader of the organization. But I will be joining discussions, making comments, and together with Marilia, have some fun. And ultimately, good learning requires some fun and enjoyment. Then we acquire more knowledge and we remember better what we learned. Thank you, and have a lot of fun over the next 2 weeks. Over to you, Marilia.
Thank you, Jovan. Thank you for this excellent introduction. I completely agree with you. Let's make it a fun and a valuable learning process. And welcome again to our course participants. And let me also take the opportunity to thank our guest lecturers. In this course, we will have a good number of guest lecturers. We acknowledge that several organizations have done tremendous work in research and developing products related to data governance issues. So we wanted to make sure that you also get in touch with the work that is being developed by this other organization. So throughout these 2 weeks, we will be joined from people from the DataSphere Initiative, the Council of Europe, IT for Change, the Swiss government, and others. So let's make sure that you have a good interaction with these external professionals as well that will join us. But let me just, without delay, pass the microphone now to our first speaker, Pilar Fajarnes from UNCTAD. Pilar, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marilia, and thank you to Diplo for inviting UNCTAD to participate in this interesting course opening event. And hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Let me first do it. Can you see it?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. So, well, in UNCTAD, as Jovan said, data are now really the lifeblood of the digital economy. So we work in my part of the work of UNCTAD, we work on the impact of digitalization on development. And by the beginning of 2020, when we thought about the topic of the Digital Economy Report for 21, we saw that the issue of data was becoming more and more important. Particularly, we saw that the development perspective was very missing in the discussion. So we thought that there were really a number of gaps that needed to be filled. And as Jovan said, also, there are many aspects to demystify and to increase understanding. In a way, we thought that there was a need to go back to the basics on what was really data, what are data flows, what it means, what are the implications for developing countries, but in general for the world, and what was the situation. So that's mainly the motivation for the Digital Economy Report 21, which we focus on the topic of cross-border data flows and development, because basically we look at the international dimension, even if we look also at the impacts on different countries. And we call it on a second title, for whom the data flow, because also one thing we saw missing was the question of the impacts really on inequalities on data. There were many discussions on the trade dimension, but there was not, or on the privacy dimension, but there was not much discussion, as I mentioned, on inequality and development. So we work on this topic. We had already in the previous report discussed about the importance, the increasing importance of data and digital platforms in the digital economy as agents, as important actors, the platforms, and these platforms are really based on data. And so our starting point is really to highlight the increasing importance of data as an economic and strategic resource. And we have there the Secretary General of the United Nations really highlighting how important data are for development, for sustainable development, and how important it is to manage them properly. If we don't manage them properly, they really can go to inequalities, increasing inequalities, and they have other non-economic dimension problems. But if we manage data properly, they can really support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. What we started doing was to really look at more or less what is really the phenomenon or the magnitude of the phenomenon we are talking. We know that in the digitalization context, we have important digital divides, but with the data-driven economy, we see that these divides and digital readiness in different countries are also being compounded by what are the data divides. We can see, for example, the global internet protocol traffic in 2022, it was considered to be, or is expected to be, more than all the internet traffic up to 2016. So really this is an exponential increase in the data that are moving around. But this in a context of different infrastructure of connections that we have. And if we see in the international dimension, it normally is measured by international bandwidth, but one of the main issues that we see is that in all the issues related to the digital economy, there is a problem of measurement. So this is a very complex topic, and this is a kind of a very far proxy, but still what the data flows show in this sense, the international bandwidth, is that the main routes are between North America and Europe, mainly the United States and Europe, and between the United States and China. And this is very linked to the question of inequality that I mentioned, is because two countries are the front runners in what is the harnessing of data, that is basically the United States and China. We have looked at a number of variables related to data through the whole value chains, through the collection, transmission, storage, processing to use. And we see that these countries are really, for example, they control 50% of the world hyperscale data centers. They have the highest rates of 5G adoption, or also they are very much into they have most of the AI startups. And in what regards the digital platforms, really they represent 90% of the market capitalization of the world's largest digital platforms. And these digital platforms really have a dominant position in the digitalization context. And this dominant position really, they have a privileged position because of the data they have access to. And what we saw also is that with the pandemic, with all of us coming online, this was even more made stronger. As I mentioned in the beginning, one of the basic motivations for us was really to understand what are the implications of data and basically the implications for development. And one major issue is that data are not only an economic resource, they are multidimensional. And they have economic dimension, which can be private value that may be coming from for these digital platforms that I mentioned, through target advertising or through the use of the platforms for e-commerce, of data services like the cloud, or it can be social value. We can use data for fighting global challenges like climate change or health. We could see how important it was during COVID to share data in order to tackle the pandemic and to really come to the vaccines. But there are also non-economic dimensions. They are related to privacy or other human rights and to security. So it is important to know this because this results in that data are really different to goods and services. They are kind of a new animal. And cross-border data flows are different to international trade. They need to be handled in a different way. They need a specific governance. And the implications of cross-border data flows will vary by the data type, so it will be very important to know the kinds of data. There are also discussions in the issue of governance on the location of the data, but the location of the data depends on a number of factors, and every country needs to make a kind of cost-benefit analysis of the different factors that may act in different directions. Then there are many discussions about the ownership of data, but in the case of data, ownership may not be the most important issue. It is the access of data, and it is the rights of access of data, control the data, and use the data. It is also important to look at the different levels of readiness of the countries that may have different possibilities or different capacities to harness the value of the data. In the context that I mentioned, the global digital corporations are in really a very privileged position to develop the capacities to turn the data into digital intelligence, and what matters for development is the value addition that goes between moving from the basic data to what we could call the data products or the digital intelligence that may be moving from data, information, and knowledge and wisdom. So the more the data are processed, the more value there is. But we see also in this situation that developing countries risk becoming just the mere providers of the raw data, and then they have to import and pay. Import, I mean, I don't like the word import because it's really related to trade. We would say they would have inflows from the data products that have been produced from their data. So the digital intelligence, they would be paying from that coming from developed countries. In this situation, what we know then is that there is a need of governance. There is a need of public policies in regarding data and data flows, and this need is increasing. These policies are needed to maximize the gains from the data economy while minimizing the risk involved, to ensure that the benefits are properly distributed or fairly distributed, and to address complex policy trade-offs. What we saw is that the oversimplifications of going strictly for free data flows or strict data localization are not very useful for development, and there is a need to look for middle ground solutions. So what global data governance would need is to tackle, to take a holistic, multidimensional, whole of government and multi-stakeholder approach. Basically, overall, it means that sharing the data, if we put together the multidimensionality of the character of the data, is that sharing the data is good to get the benefits of the data, but the benefits of the data need to be fairly distributed, and the concerns and the risk related to data, for example, on privacy, on human rights, or on security, they need to be addressed. This is what would be the objective. So we analyze what is the situation in relation to data governance right now. If we look with the main areas of influence in the data domain, we have three major areas with different kind of data governance approaches, which is risking fragmentation in the global data economy. The approach in the United States is basically looking at the control of the data by the private sector. The European Union is mostly control of the data by individuals based on fundamental values, and China is mostly focusing on the control of data by the government. This also translates into expansion strategies to increase the control of data in other countries, which is very similar. In the United States, is through private digital companies. The European Union is doing it through regulatory leadership and partnerships, and China through the digital Silk Road. But this situation implies a risk of fragmentation in the digital space and for internet that, as we know, is like should have no borders in a way. I mean, for the benefits of the digital economy come from really the flow of the data. It creates tensions among the major players, mainly between China and the United States, and we all know there is a race for leadership in technological developments to gain these economic and strategic advantages. And in these, global digital platforms are continuing to expand their own data ecosystems. This silo-oriented approach is really going against the original spirit of the internet and is likely to work, is not likely to work for the interests of developing countries for many reasons. Really, what works is, in economic terms, interoperability should be really generating better outcomes. Fragmentation has a number of risks for reducing competition and allowing more government dominance. It could also create problems for collaboration across jurisdiction, but also the issue is that in the absence of an international system that regulates data flows, some countries may only see the option to restrict data flows in order to meet their policy objectives. The conclusion, we did a mapping of the different approaches by different countries with regard to data policies, and the conclusion is clear that there is no one-size-fits-all for regulating cross-border data flows. Different conditions in different countries will determine the national approach, and these conditions can be technical, political, social, economic, cultural, or institutional. The reasons that different countries have, the policy reasons also vary, and they may have more emphasis in one or the other. It may be objectives of economic development, it may be the protection of privacy and other human rights, law enforcement or national security. And the legal instruments covering policies on cross-border data flows may also vary. You have there some examples, and what this shows is that this is really a whole of society and a whole of government approach that is needed, because really it is a cross-sectional issue, this question of data. And as Jovan said, it affects all of us. We also look at what is going on at the international level in different international agreements. What we show is that most of the regional and international agreements are either focusing on trade, or there are other agreements and initiatives that maybe most of the time they are focusing on privacy issues. So on the trade regime, there are at different levels, multilateral, bilateral, and others. You have some examples there. One question is, I don't know if later on the presentation will be shared. I guess you will have these details, or you can go to the report. But the overall conclusion of this is that these current regional and international regulatory frameworks are either too narrow in scope, they focus mostly on trade or maybe on privacy, or too limited geographically. And this data, the challenge of data governance is really a global challenge. So these frameworks fail to enable cross-border data flows with an equitable sharing of the economic development gains while properly addressing the risk. So we concluded that what is needed is a balanced global approach to data governance that needs to work for people on the planet. And the objectives would be in terms of reducing inequality, enabling the global data sharing and developing of global digital public goods, the need to reduce further fragmentation in the digital space, increasing trust and reducing uncertainty, addressing policy challenges that emerge from the dominant position of global digital platforms, and then to account for spillovers of national policies into other countries. All this is with a view to enabling data to flow across borders as freely as necessary and possible, but at the same time, addressing the different development objectives. And we saw a number of data-related policy areas that would need action. It is important to agree on definitions and taxonomies, because if we look at the different regulations on data in different countries, what is understood by data is different, and also on taxonomies, it's very important to know the type of data, because according to the type of data, it would be possible to establish terms of access of data. As I mentioned, one of the problems is the issue of measurement, and it is important, therefore, to strengthen measurement of the phenomena related to data and data flows, to deal with data as a global public good, look at emerging forms of data governance, and other possibilities to agree on rights and principles or developing standards. And of course, it is very important to increase international cooperation on platform governance, because what this would imply, for example, competition and taxation policies that are really key in terms of development. And on this, our conclusion really would be that there is a need of a new global institutional framework. There is a need to think international governance of data in different terms, to rethink what is the relationship between data and development. And we see it in an institutional framework that would be multilateral, multi-stakeholder, and multidisciplinary. And in this, we see an important role to be played by the United Nations. There could be a new United Nations coordinating body on data governance, because really the global debates on the governance of data and cross-border data flows need to be fully inclusive. We see that many discussions are still not including a number of developing countries, and particularly the least developed countries. And the United Nations would be the most inclusive forum in terms of country representation. So this new coordination body would need a strong data mandate and the right skills, because skills is also one of and the capacity to really deal with data governance is one of the problems we saw from the beginning in the preparation of the report. And that's why I'm very pleased that this course is focusing on emerging countries, because one of the issues we were very interested is to have experts from developing countries to work with us. And it was not so easy, so it's very important to build capacities in this matter. And this body would build on already existing initiatives in the United Nations and beyond. So I would leave it here and be pleased to respond to any question afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pilar. I never missed the opportunity to congratulate UNCTAD on the work that you have developed, because I think that you are on one of the few international organizations that really successfully includes the development angle when we're talking about economic issues internationally. I have been closely following your work since I was a lawyer working on intellectual property. So I was pleased to see that some questions on the chat are already bringing in the issue of intellectual property, which I believe is very connected to the issue of data governance, as we will mention throughout the course. But particularly, I would like to congratulate you for this report, because I think that many times when we discuss data and data governance, we don't do a thorough research. And I think that this report does do thorough research of the field and also make some concrete proposals. We may agree with it or not, but I think it's very important at this stage to put concrete proposals at the table so we can assess and discuss them. And I'm really pleased to see that we already have several questions coming up on the chat. It is a good prognosis for this course and the participation that we will have in these 2 weeks. So let me just quickly mention them. I think that many of them are directed to Pilar, but also to give Luca the opportunity to reflect on a few of them if he wants. The first of them is a provocative question: is the era of borderless data ending? And this is a question from Mulud, because as he acknowledges, many countries aim to control data produced by their citizens and organizations nowadays. So is free data flow something that is about to end? The second question is related to the measurement of data flows. And I know this is something that you touch upon on the report. So perhaps on the question and answers, you could expand a little bit more on the measurement of data flows, Pilar. There is a question on rights to access, control, and use. What is the difference and how can we request the right to access data if we don't have ownership over the data? We had some discussion about that on the chat. And a question about equitable sharing of economic development gains while properly addressing the risks that you mentioned. How can we make sure that we achieve this, strike this balance, which is a difficult one? So I will let Pilar go through the chat if she has the chance to take a look at the questions. But now I'd like to move to Luca. Let me turn to you. Pilar provided an excellent overview of the issue from a zoomed out international perspective. And in one of her slides, she mentions that there are 3 main models of data governance: US, European Union, and China. And although we usually focus on the US and China for obvious reasons, China is increasingly working in partnership with other countries, particularly within the BRICS. And I know that you have been the conductor of a small orchestra of researchers that are working on BRICS digital policy issues. So you do have a very good idea of what is happening in the regulatory landscape of the BRICS countries. So perhaps you could share a little bit of this panorama with us, Luca. Does it point towards fragmentation? How do you see the development of data policy?
Yes, thank you very much, Maria, for inviting me to this really excellent debate, and congratulations to Pilar Hannes for her very good introductory presentation. It's an excellent work, and I know the report is really a very excellent piece of research. Now, I would like to narrow down a little bit, or if we can say so, the approach from the larger UN perspective with a supposedly smaller one, but yet very relevant and intriguing. So my presentation that I have prepared for today is about how data governance is taking place at the level of the BRICS grouping, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which is a very peculiar grouping, I would say. But as we will see in the next 10 minutes, it's very relevant, especially and increasingly with regard to digital policies and technology governance. Now, before this, we start, just a little bit of introduction. I work at FGV, which is one of the main institutions in Brazil, but it's also a think tank. It's currently ranked as the 3rd most influential think tank in the world out of roughly 11,000 think tanks. There, I coordinate the Center for Technology and Society, which is our center at the law school, that analyzes the impact of technology on society, indeed. And as Maria was mentioning, over the past 4 years, we have been developing this project called Cyber BRICS, which is the only existing project mapping, analyzing digital policies in the BRICS countries, and then try to put forward recommendations to help BRICS countries improve their digital policies, especially in the areas of data governance and cybersecurity, internet access, and digital transformation.
Lucas, sorry to interrupt. Your sound is breaking a bit. So you have other
Let
applications.
me try without my earplugs. Is it better like this?
It sounds as if it's more related to your bandwidth or to having many things open at the same time. I don't know. Maybe if you can close a few applications.
Yeah, I only have a browser open at this moment, but is it better if I am closer to the mic? Can you hear better like this?
Sounds louder for me, but it's still a little bit choppy. If we have issues, I will interrupt you again, and then we try something else. Thank you.
Just wanted to mention that all the material I will mention is available on the CyberBRICS website. Everything is for free, of course, and also the recording of our previous events are available. And so to understand why the BRICS are relevant, well, first, of course, we are speaking about 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that represent almost 30% of global trade, more than 40% of the global economy, of global population, and almost 50% of the internet population. So if we have this in mind, we understand that actually the policies, the digital policies they elaborate and implement impact not only an enormous part of the world population directly, but almost all countries that consider them as, to some extent, either main regional partners or main trade partners. Right? Now, to understand why BRICS were created and what is their impact is useful to remind the words of one of the main figures, leading figures behind the creation of BRICS, former president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, that stated that the logic behind BRICS is not to copy what other clubs do, but do things different, right? So we can see the BRICS as the G7 of the global South. It's like a G5, if you want, of developing countries, leading developing economies, trying to create a synergy and to promote reform at the global level and in global governance. But so how digital policies and data governance enters into the picture, how this grouping created to foster synergy on global governance and trade ends up discussing digital policies? Well, the answer is pretty easy. In 2013, due to the Snowden revelation, we have global knowledge of the massive surveillance schemes going on. And one of the main and most visible targets of this scheme was Dilma Rousseff, former Brazilian president herself, illegally wiretapped. So at the time, Brazil co-sponsors, together with Germany, where also Angela Merkel was personally wiretapped, the UN Resolution 68167 that leads to the creation of the UN Rapporteur for Privacy, so the resolution of privacy in the digital age. Then Brazil adopts Marco Civil da Internet, which is the Brazilian digital rights framework, and also starts again under the inputs of this scandal, the consultation, and that leads to the adoption of LGPD, the Brazilian data protection law. At the same time, something that goes relatively under the radar, but has equally as enormous importance, for the first time in 2013, with the Itequini Declaration, the BRICS countries stress for the first time the paramount importance of working together on cybersecurity issues. So we have for the first time here digital policy entering into the picture of the BRICS grouping. And what do? They don't start synergies in a typically Western way through a treaty. They start synergy in a typically developmental way. So first, creating a joint working group on ICT security, sharing continuously information about their approaches, sharing good practices, but also bad practices according to your point of view. They create also an MOU, a memorandum of understanding on cooperation on science, technology, and innovation. So cooperation based on joint research and development initiative. And critically, they also established their only institution of the BRICS, the new development bank, a development bank created by the BRICS to fund ambitious infrastructural projects, including digital infrastructure. And this is what basically we call in internet governance vernacular enhanced cooperation process. This type of process was created by the Tunis Agenda in 2005. So you will study this Tunis Agenda, one of the main output of the World Summit of Information Society led by the UN. And this concept of enhanced cooperation that comes from European law jargon was integrated by the UN, but never fully specified. Well, the BRICS give us a very good example of how this plays out in terms of digital policies, increasing synergies amongst a very narrow grouping, but yet with enormous potential. And the BRICS are very open about this. They even include this willingness to cooperate in digital governance and particularly on data protection issues in their BRICS ICT ministers' declarations. This is from 2020, but this kind of commitment goes on at least since 2017 with the Xiamen Declaration, where the BRICS head of states, they explicitly advocated their commitment to establish shared international rules on ICT security and data protection. So let's also remind that since the establishment of the BRICS, no head of state has ever missed a reunion of the BRICS, in a summit that happens every year. Every year there is a rotating presidency and no head of state has ever missed a reunion. So this really means that they attach enormous importance to this kind of gathering, even if recently has had a very low profile. Now, if they want to create common shared norms on data governance, well, what we have been doing at with our Cyber BRICS project is precisely to map what they already have. And actually, BRICS countries have, since the Xiamen Declaration, they have either created new frameworks or completely renewed their framework or implemented and enacted relevant parts of it. The only country that still has not fully enacted the framework is India, because they keep on renewing their data protection bill. But again, if you want to compare them, we have this very nice interactive tool on cyberbricks.info where we have mapped the entire frameworks with 30 different questions going from rights to definitions, rights, institutions, also how their data protection frameworks interact with AI regulation. You find everything for free. Then the first finding of our mapping were included in this paper on data protection in the BRICS, enhanced cooperation and convergence towards legal interoperability that I drafted and was included as an outcome of the World Internet Conference organized by the Chinese Academy of Cyberspace Studies. And this actually, for the first time, identified some common trends in the BRICS that, again, are not the result of a shared treaty. There is no shared treaty on data governance within the BRICS, but increased communication and alignments and the need to adopt new data frameworks, of course, and also the fact that they take inspiration from common source of inspiration has led to these converging trends. So very similar, well, actually almost the same principle base in their national frameworks, very similar sets of rights for the data subjects, very similar obligations for data controllers and processors, although these are called with different labels. So the controller is usually the entity that decides how data are collected and for what purposes, and the processor is the implementer entity, right? You have very similar obligations in the BRICS countries for these entities, and also increasingly over the past years, convergent approaches to international data transfers. So they all have developed their own adequacy mechanism, which is something that previously only the EU had the possibility to have, to rubber stamp the adequacy of a foreign country to allow data transfers. The BRICS countries, they have all created their own mechanism, and they are very converging in their principles, in the way they want to implement it. Over the past couple of years, they have established this or are in the process of establishing this. So there is an increasing convergence among the grouping. And if you want to have a big picture, you can also download the open access version of this book, where we map these 5 dimensions of cybersecurity: data protection, consumer protection, cybercrime, online public order and cyber defense in the BRICS. This is actually a little bit outdated because we published it last year, and in only 2 years, a tremendous amount of innovation also happened. So if you want an update, there is also this paper that you can also find in open access, of course, where I identify what are the critical areas that over the past 2 years actually have led to enormous convergence amongst the BRICS. One of them is, of course, data security. And this has been very explicitly spelled by BRICS leaders. So this picture that looks very much like the advertisement of a Tarantino movie is in fact the BRICS family picture. So every year there is, as I was mentioning, there is a rotating presidency. In 2021, the chairmanship was of India. And in the Delhi Declaration, for the first time in paragraph 27, the BRICS not only stated their interest in creating practical intra-BRICS cooperation on cybersecurity, but also for the first time, they advocated a BRICS intergovernmental agreement on cybersecurity. So they somehow crossed the Rubicon, stating explicitly their willingness to enhance cooperation also with intergovernmental agreements, right? This was also reiterated only some weeks ago with the 14th summit chaired by China. And in the Beijing Declaration, also we see again this. The head of state reiterate the importance, you see here highlighted in blue, the importance of establishing legal frameworks of cooperation amongst BRICS countries on ICT security. And these, of course, include as one of the main issues, data security. But how to do this? I will explore some of the opportunities and challenges to build legal, not only interoperability, but also legal interoperability amongst BRICS digital ecosystems in this paper that will be released in a couple of weeks at the World Internet Conference as one of the outputs of the World Internet Conference. So there will be a collection, a book released in Chinese and English in a couple of weeks. I will share it, of course, in the Cyber BRICS website. And also, if you are interested in these issues, please stay tuned because we have a couple of very interesting publications that will be released in the next few months. We are finalizing them. So a book on data architectures in the BRICS, with not only analyzing the frameworks, but also putting forward recommendations for further convergence. A book on digital sovereignty in the BRICS, which is also a very complementary and interesting issue. And last but not least, of course, a special issue on digital transformations in the BRICS. Thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward for the Q&A for further discussion.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you very much. I think that you touch upon one of the points that will be key in this course, which is to show how data governance is really a transversal topic that cuts across many of the digital policy issues that we discuss many times in a fragmented manner, such as data protection and cybersecurity and trade issues that were mentioned by Pilar in the beginning. That's one of the reasons why I think it's so challenging to put in place a holistic framework for data governance, because we need to really cut across the different policy areas and build bridges that were not there before. But I think that laboratory to look at BRICS countries is a very interesting one because of the partnership of these major economies that really, when they decide something on the digital economy, they have the market size and the power to influence the direction that regulation is going. We are getting short on time. I would like to pass the floor to Pilar so she could address the questions that were asked before, which I already read, and I hope that you had the chance to take a look at the questions. Pilar, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marilia. Thank you for the interesting questions. I see that there is, I'm not sure if it is a question, but just a comment, and is on the question of borderless data and the control of data by countries. Really, this is the conflict in the question of data flows, because basically we have the internet and the digitalization requires data to flow, but at the same time, there are all these calls for the digital and data sovereignty, which really, again, is another problem of definitions, because there are different interpretations about what digital and data sovereignty means. But this is basically what why there is a need of proper data governance at the global level so that we can really benefit from what the digital economy and what the data can offer. And we can at the same time tackle the problems, and there can be good, fair distribution of the benefits. On the question of measurement, certainly in a way, Marilia has replied, it is clearly a problem to measure data. The only proxy we have is the international bandwidth, and it's really a very far proxy. The point, it provides an indication, but the point is that if we think, again, we would need to think about the definition of data. Jovan mentioned the question of zeros and ones. I mean, if we think about data as zeros and ones, in the end, all the digitalization is about data, and we cannot really, I mean, if we think that is about the flow of zeros and ones, we cannot really go too far. We really need to understand that these zeros and ones represent something. And then from the definitions, we look at different aspects of what data are. And we thought that the best definitions was coming from Statistics Canada, that says that data are observations that have been converted into a digital form that can be stored, transmitted, or processed, and from which knowledge can be drawn. So data, from our understanding in UNCTAD, is really the raw data. Then you can process the data, and then you can call it a data product or data intelligence or digital intelligence. But already one of the main problems in the regulation and in the measuring is to look at this difference between data and data products. And for us, this is the main issue in development, because the value addition comes when you take the raw data and you process it into the digital intelligence. What is valuable is the digital intelligence, but there is a huge difference in terms of development. And the problem with international bandwidth is that it's only measuring the numbers of zeros and ones that are going in that are being transferred in the different, we can think in the submarine cables, which are the main channel of transmission of international data flows, but it's not really looking at what is in the data or what it is really also the direction, which is very important, because the direction, I mean, there is a difference between inflows and outflows, then it is not possible really to come to conclusions. And then also if they are raw data or data products. So in the end, it is not really possible to say much of international bandwidth more than a kind of an idea of how much they are increasing, which is really very much. The other thing on the issue of value of data, again, Marilia mentioned that the OECD is doing work on that, but it is basically doing on the value of data products. Again, from the perspective of development, it is a problem. But this is a question that really on the difficulty in data. But there are different working groups working on that. And even with the difficulties, there are attempts to come to some kind of measurement. With relation to ownership and the issue of rights of access, control, and use against ownership, the point is that, again, Marilia responded in a way, but one point is that basically data are different. Data, for example, if we think about, Marilia mentioned in the case of non-personal data, but also in the case of personal data, if I consider my data, they are not really my property because my data are me. So in a way, I cannot detach the data from me. They will always be me, my data. The point is really that what is important is to have to determine and to establish the rights of access, of control, and of use of the data in the same way that when we started to have property rights for goods, for example. So basically, this is also the reason why there is a need for new thinking on the governance of data, to think in terms of rights more than property. And also talking about data markets, even if there are some kinds of data markets, there is no really a market of data for data. I cannot go and buy data. All the people cannot go and buy data. It's not so easy. The international organizations, I would agree that there are many, but the point is that this is an issue that is cross-sectional. So it is important that different organizations look at the data from their perspective. What would be important from the point of global governance is that there is some coordination of the different work. I'm afraid that on the international, on the intellectual property, I don't have much of an answer. I really don't know much, but again, I would make the difference between raw data and data products. I think the data products can be still governed with many of the aspects that or the governance that we have, because it is possible in the data products, for example, to find the intellectual property, or for example, to consider them a service. It is not the same with the raw data, but you cannot have data products without the raw data. So there is a need to regulate the whole process. And I think there was a question for clarification on what was meant with narrowing scope, and then the question of geographical reach and the distribution and risk. The question of narrowing scope is basically because, as I mentioned, the difference, one of the main difference with data, the particular nature of data comes because they are multidimensional. So if you look at them only from the 3 dimension and you only regulate them from the 3 dimension, you are missing the other dimensions. And what this results basically in the need to regulate them from a holistic approach. The same applies to the question of the geographical reach, because data are really a global phenomenon. They have global reach. So if they are only regulated in one region, we are missing the rest of the world. The question of the distribution of the benefits is that really, as I mentioned, there are huge inequalities in the capacities and the privileges to access the data. So it is important that global governance and national governance try to ensure that there is a proper distribution of the benefits, in the sense that what we see now is that these global digital platforms are extracting our data from us, or the data in general, and then they are benefiting from them without the generators of the data, which is the different people or the developing countries, being able to really have rights to these gains. So there is a need to ensure this fair distribution. And on the question of the risk, again, it's important to have safeguards in order to ensure that privacy and other human rights are respected, that the national security objectives are also maintained. So basically, I think these were most of the issues. If I miss something, I'm open to continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Pilar. We are out of the time. So I asked the participants for 5 minutes of their time. So Luca can address the 2 questions that were asked to him. But of course, if you have to leave, feel free to. Luca, there were 2 questions for you on the chat. If you saw, one about data localization, mentioning how some BRICS countries, especially Russia, India, and China, have enacted data exports and data localization provisions, and how do you see this trend evolving? And the second one about the expansion of the BRICS, if there's conversations about that, and an appetite to have other African countries in particular joining. Luca.
Very much for the questions, and I will try to be brief so that everyone can then move on with their activities. Now, with regard to data localizations and that frequently overlap with digital sovereignty discussions, well, I think first of all, I think it's good to have the complete picture. So the first countries or block of countries that defined some kind of limits to international data flows was the European Union in the 90s. Already in the 90s, where they adopted adequate mechanisms, so allowing free flows of data only towards countries considered as adequate, so with the similar, substantially equivalent levels of protections. The other countries could not access can process personal data of European citizens, right? So that is a form of data localization, of restrictions of international data flows, if you want. Then fast forward 10 years, actually 20 years, the first country that really adopts a data localization provision is Russia in 2015. Again, right after the Snowden revelations, which revealed to the entire world that there was massive scheme of surveillance going on, even in countries that adopted data protection laws, like again, Germany. I was mentioning before that not only Dilma Rousseff, Brazilian president, was wiretapped illegally at the time, also Angela Merkel, president of Germany, was wiretapped illegally at the time. So that scheme that revealed was a wake-up call for most countries, but specifically for BRICS countries, right? Which started doing something. And again, let's not forget, as a little detail, that Mr. Snowden has been living in Moscow since that time. So, of course, he has been explaining thoroughly the type of insight that Western countries could have through technology. And that is the second very important point. Everyone is in favor of free data flows, but we have to admit, and that is a point upon which also Pilar was also stressing the relevance of digital platforms. We have to admit that these data flows over the past 30 years have been somehow unidirectional, going from the entire world to American servers, and over the past few years also Chinese servers, is true. But that exactly is the reason why some years ago, when the Trump administration started adopting executive orders to block enterprise at will, they started to threaten ByteDance and TikTok with blocking, precisely because it was the first example of a non-US platform having global success and turning these data flows not only unidirectional toward the US server, but also toward other servers. So it was the first time that the US were faced with their own technique of hoovering data globally, and their reaction was menacing, threatening, blocking, right? Now, let's also remember that at the same time where the Trump administration was threatening to block TikTok, the EU Court of Justice adopted a ruling, a binding ruling that so far has not yet been applied thoroughly, considering in the Schrems 2 case that the US system was not adequate. So even if European data were flowing toward American servers over the past 20 years, the EU law creates an obligation, GDPR, and before it, the EU Data Protection Directive created an obligation to have this adequacy mechanism that was in place and twice has been considered inadequate by the European Court of Justice. So again, this localization is not only a phenomenon that is particularly relevant in some of the BRICS countries, it's something that is going on in every country that at the end of the day has an effective data protection system. Now, this is not only about having control over your population's personal data. It's also a very simple question of protectionism. If you are home of 1.5 billion individuals, like India and China are, now guess what? Who produces personal data? The new oil of the 21st century, the world's most valuable asset, people. So if 1.5 billion people live in your country, you are basically sitting on a gold mine, and you have to choose either to give it for free to US corporation to exploit or to be protectionist. Well, some countries are protectionist simply because they don't want to use an enormous wealth. And again, this is also another point that Pilar touched upon, but I think it's worth stressing again. When data are collected in one country and processed in another country, then the value they generate is not the fiscal tributation is not in the country where they are hoovered, but in the country where the server is located and generates wealth. So taxes de facto are paid not if there was no data localization or any kind of framework stimulating the creation of data server for processing data nationally, it would be simply impossible to have any kind of fiscal regime that allows to earn a part of the enormous revenue that is generated through data processing, right? And that is all about the discussion of base erosion and process shifting that has been happening over the past 10 years at the OECD and has found a very poor, in my opinion, compromise recently, and does not allow so far to have sustainable and equitable fiscal regime to not to allow to extract enormous value and simply delocalize value in other countries out of countries with large population, which is what indeed generate personal data. Now, sorry if I'm speaking too much. Just last point about expansion of BRICS. Yes, it is possible, and actually I think it is already taking place. There is a BRICS Plus initiative, and actually it's only a few weeks ago, Argentina and Iran presented their bid to join the BRICS. And I also read very recently that Turkey, Egypt, and Nigeria have, and Indonesia is also considering joining the BRICS club. So yes, there is room for expansion. And I think in the current situation with very enhanced geopolitical reformulation, it is very likely that this will happen in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you very much to both speakers, Luca and Pilar. I think that we managed to achieve our goal for this first session, which is to shake the debate and to present some perhaps out of the ordinary views on data flows. I know that much has been said about data flows, but I think that insufficiently from a development perspective. And our goal was to start a course presenting these issues from a development perspective and some of the points that perhaps we don't hear every day. So I think it puts us in a provocative state of mind to start our discussions in the first module. Right after this session, you will receive an email from Priyanti with the tasks for the upcoming week. I am really looking forward to discussing and exchanging with you in the classroom. And once more, thank you for being here today, for exchanging with us, for staying longer. And thank you to both of the speakers for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. Have a good continuation of the day. Thank you. See you in class.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.